Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast. On today's episode, let's talk about 7 types of words, phrases, and vocabulary you should always avoid including in your English resumes, applications, and job interviews. Find the entire transcript on thinkinginenglish.blog or head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast, for more excellent English content. The average time recruiters, hiring managers, and universities spend looking at applications and resumes is less than 10 seconds for the most competitive opportunities. Less than 10 seconds. And most of the time, you only have 1 or 2 pages to stand out. Moreover, right now there are millions of people quitting their jobs and looking for new employment. It is a very competitive job market. Therefore, it is vital that you carefully choose the best vocabulary, the best phrases, and the most accurate information that will effectively and efficiently communicate your value and your uniqueness. It's a delicate balance. You need to emphasize your qualities, but at the same time, write something clear and different from other candidates. Over the past few weeks, I've tried to give you some words and terms you should include in your resume and application. The first episode focused on alternative adjectives to commonly selected, overused, or boring options. Such powerful adjectives should be combined with strong action verbs that highlight your abilities and agency. You can find both of the previous episodes linked here on the blog or in the description um, in the description of the podcast. Keywords including to establish, to increase, and to negotiate will allow you to give clear evidence of your previous experience, qualifications, and what makes you different. Rather than simply saying you are hardworking or saying you are a good communicator, use action verbs and powerful adjectives to clearly and eloquently express this. Today, I want to focus on things you should not include in your applications. I've briefly mentioned a few things in previous episodes, but today I'll go into more detail and try to provide more examples of specific phrases and things you should avoid. I also recommend to all of my students who are writing university personal statements or applying to a new job to read the famous writer George Orwell's essay on politics and the English language. Why? Well, Orwell describes the common mistakes that people make when writing. I recorded a podcast on his suggestions last year, which you could also listen to. Words to avoid on resumes and applications. Number 1, business jargon. So, first, please avoid business jargon and lingo. What is jargon? Well, these are special words and phrases used by a specific profession which can be difficult to others to understand. You may think that including jargon makes you seem more professional or intelligent, but it can actually weaken your application. George Orwell pointed this out in his essay 70 years ago, but millions of people still make the same mistakes today. Why avoid jargon? Well, first, plain and clear language that focuses on explaining your qualities is far more effective. Sometimes jargon can make you seem like a tryhard or overconfident. Furthermore, often the first people to read your CV or application are not always specialists in your specific industry. Especially at big companies and universities, The HR department or hiring department will screen your application first before it reaches the professionals in the relevant departments. Here are some examples of terrible business jargon that you should always try to avoid: synergy, move the needle, bottom line, leverage, bandwidth, game changer, wheelhouse. Yeah, try to avoid these words, they're not good. Number two is givens. So, the next type of word to never include in your resume's applications or never use in a job interview are givens. What does given mean? Well, a given is a known or already established fact or situation. We only have a short amount of time and limited space to make an impression. Thus, there are quite a few phrases and words you shouldn't include as they don't add anything to your application. What do I mean? Well, think about phrases including team player, hard worker, people person. These sound great, right? Actually, no, I don't think so. They don't sound great. Why? Every single job in the entire world expects you to be a hard worker. So it is a given. It is expected. The person reading your resume will expect these qualities anyway, without needing you to write down the word hard worker or team player. If you're not a team player, if you're not a people person, then they probably won't hire you. If you want to mention how hardworking you are in your application, you should use action verbs and phrases that demonstrate your hard work and dedication, instead of just writing the phrase. For example, here's an example sentence: simultaneously coordinated 3 different projects, assumed leadership positions within the team, and organized weekly meetings. So here, you have showed how hardworking you are, while also showing your value, and without needing to write the phrase hardworking. Next, passive language. So try to avoid passive language in your resume. I'm sure you expected this. Last week's episode was focused on using action verbs to emphasize your role and responsibilities. Why avoid passive language? Well, we use the passive voice when we don't know the person doing an action or the action is more important than the person doing it. For instance, the house was built 5 years ago. In this sentence, we don't specifically know who built it, and most of the time we don't care. We care that the house was built. That's the most important part. In a resume, however, we do care about the person who does the action because that person is you. If you are a builder, you should write, I built that house 5 years ago. Your career doesn't exactly happen passively and by itself. Instead, you need to take credit for all of the amazing things that happen in your career. You need to use strong action verbs and active sentences. Make an impression on your future employer and make sure everyone knows that you are responsible for the great things that you have done in the past. So don't use passive voice. Make yourself active and in charge. Next is first person. Now, you should generally avoid using first person language in resumes and CVs. First person language includes pronouns like I, we, and me. So this is specifically for resumes and CVs. Ignore this if you are writing an application, like a personal statement for university, a cover letter for a job, or you're in a job interview. Of course, in these situations, you need to write full sentences, full grammatically correct sentences using I, we, and me. When writing or speaking normally, in these full sentences and paragraphs, of course, we need to use pronouns. But in a resume and a CV, you are writing short, isolated sentences about yourself, almost in bullet points, 1 point, second point, third point. The recruiter or the hiring manager also knows that the document is about you. So you, so you don't necessarily need to start each sentence with I. For instance, it is perfectly acceptable to write phrases like managed a highly successful department with 20 employees, developed an application which increased productivity by over 50%, mentored school children from disadvantaged backgrounds. You don't need to start the sentence with the word I in a CV. Start with a key, strong action verb instead, like managed, developed, and mentored. Spelling mistakes. Now, this is obvious, but you would be surprised how many people make mistakes and grammatical errors in their applications. I think every single application I've ever double checked, it was my job at university and I still do it now, um, has had mistakes in it. And I think maybe if you check my podcasts, I probably make mistakes, spelling mistakes, and grammatical mistakes in my podcast transcripts. But if you are trying to convince the recruiter or the hiring manager that you are an organized, careful, and detail oriented person, a spelling mistake, grammatical error, or typo makes you look incredibly unprofessional. How can you be a great proofreader or very detail oriented if you miss these mistakes? Especially in a CV or resume, because it's only one page and it's supposed to be showing the best about you. Mistakes are easy to make, especially if you are applying to numerous jobs, changing your application a little each time. Small errors can creep into your writing. Moreover, if you are listening to my podcast, English is probably not your native language, which makes it really likely that you could make some small mistakes. Some of the most common misspelt words include necessary, accommodate, colleague, entrepreneur, experience, and separate, which are all common words people include in their CVs and applications. So double check these words. Usually, Microsoft Word spell check is good enough to catch these mistakes. Google Docs is not as good. But yeah, Word generally can find these mistakes. And for grammar, you should ask a native English speaking friend to double check your application or use a professional proofreading service online. Be careful though. Some of my previous students and clients have asked their friends for help or used some services on the internet that were the cheapest, but after they received their application back, it was still full of mistakes. Just because a friend speaks English doesn't mean they will be able to help you write an application. Um, yeah, and if you send me a message, I may also be able to help. I specialize in university and postgraduate applications to study in the UK. Oh, and one more thing: try to keep your English consistent. If you like British English spelling, that is fine, even in America. But make sure your whole resume is written in British English. Switching between American and British rules and vocabulary may be a little confusing. So be consistent. Choose British spelling, choose American spelling. Don't mix them together. Generalizations. Last week's episode focused on using action words to emphasize your qualities and skills. The key part of this is to provide evidence to support your claims. If you want to tell your employer you are hardworking, give them evidence and use strong action verbs to highlight your experience and roles. The next step, the next advanced step in this process is to avoid generalizations. A generalization is a general, so not specific, concept or statement, such as phrases including, I increased profits, or I cut costs. How can you avoid generalizations? Well, give specific examples. Use numbers. I increased profits by 80%, or I cut costs by $50,000. Show recruiters and hiring managers how important you are by giving them some context. Tell them a number which they can easily understand. Also, avoid generalizations like expert or accomplished. Again, use action verbs and evidence to demonstrate this. General phrases of self promotion. I guess technically this is a mix of generalizations, givens, and business jargon. It's really difficult for many people to explain why they are great. Most of us are humble and struggle to highlight what we are good at. And many people try to solve this problem by relying on general phrases of self promotion that don't specifically explain your qualities, value, or qualifications. The problem is that these phrases can be ineffective, boring, and overused. Some of the most common examples of general phrases of self promotion include results driven, strategic thinker, detail oriented, proactive, and self starter. Please avoid using these phrases as much as possible. If you want to make it clear that you're a strategic thinker, provide an example of a time you needed to think strategically. For example, identified an opportunity to grow the business through social media marketing and implemented a strategy which successfully grew clients by 10% through targeted advertisements. So, in that sentence, I used strong action verbs. I gave a specific example of a 10% increase, and I didn't use the first person. So, here is today's final thought. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to show you all some of the most common mistakes people make in their resumes, applications, and job interviews. You need to be as clear and effective as possible when writing or speaking. And to do this, I encourage you all to avoid overused and boring terms. Try to show, rather than say, why you are the best candidate. Avoid using business jargon, givens, generalizations, and general phrases of self promotion. And make sure you are writing actively, without any spelling or grammar mistakes, and avoid using the first person in a CV or resume. Over the past few weeks, I have tried to show you things to include and not include in your applications. I hope the next time you need to write something like this in English, you will remember my tips and apply them correctly. In fact, they probably work for most languages. If you haven't already, check out the previous 2 episodes on adjectives and action verbs. And also, if you have any requests on topics similar to this, or you'd like some more specific advice, feel free to send me a message on Instagram or through the contact form on the blog. In the last week, I've given a few pieces of advice to 2 or 3 different people who are having job interviews in the next few weeks. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really appreciate every single person who takes the time to listen to my podcast. Make sure you head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, so you can read the whole transcript of today's episode and look at some of the other content I upload onto the blog. You can also check out my Instagram page. I post very regularly, and if you want to message me, I always reply to people on Instagram. Please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave a rating on Spotify. You can do that now, and I'm trying to get to 150 ratings by the end of February. Please recommend to all of your friends and maybe share on social media. And why not go back and listen to a few of the old episodes? It's one of the best ways to support the podcast. You can also donate on the Thinking in English blog by going to the support page. And yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.